They called her our wife until he married someone else and kicked her into a storm. But when a $60 billion motorcade of gold Rolls-Royces arrived to collect the new heiress, he realized too late that she didn't just own the empire. She owned every person he had ever loved, and she was about to make them forget he ever existed. They called her our wife, not his wife, not a wife. Our wife, as if she were property divided equally among the household, a warm body assigned to cook, clean, bow, and disappear. For 11 years, she wore that title like a brand burned into skin. Not a name, but a role. Not a woman, but a function. Every morning she rose before the sun to serve a man who had never once learned the sound of her laugh. Every evening she sat at the far end of a table where no chair had ever been pulled out for her. They called her our wife, and she let them because she had buried something so vast, so terrifying, so completely unimaginable inside the silence of her obedience that the day she stopped hiding it would shake the very ground beneath their feet. But he married someone else, not quietly, not with shame. He married someone else the way kings announce conquests, with flowers, fanfare, and a guest list that included every person she had ever trusted. And when the celebration was done, and the new bride's perfume still hung in the hallway, he looked at the woman who had given him 11 years of her life and said 6 words that were meant to destroy her. You need to leave, right now. He kicked her into a storm, and not a metaphor of a storm, a real, raging, violent storm. Rain so heavy it turned the driveway into a river. Wind so fierce it bent the iron gate she had painted with her own hands 3 summers ago. She stood outside with nothing but the clothes she wore to his wedding as a guest. Yes, she attended his wedding as a guest. And she looked back at the house she had maintained, the empire she had quietly, invisibly, strategically built around him like armor he never knew he was wearing. She looked back, and she did not cry. That was the first sign they all missed. Then came the morning that rewrote every rule. $60 billion worth of motorcade, gold Rolls-Royces, 14 of them, moving through the town like a slow and sovereign procession of power that made every building on the street look apologetic, rolled to a stop in front of the woman standing on the sidewalk with rain still drying in her hair. A $60 billion motorcade of gold Rolls-Royces arrived to collect her, not rescue her, collect her, the way empires collect what belongs to them. And when the door of the lead Rolls-Royce opened and a man in a suit worth more than the house she'd just been kicked out of stepped forward and said, "The board has been waiting, ma'am. The empire is ready for its heiress." Every neighbor watching from behind curtains finally understood something that shattered them. She wasn't just connected to wealth. She was the source of it. She didn't just own the empire. She owned every person he had ever loved. Their jobs, their contracts, their children's school board seats, their medical insurance, their mortgages, their silence, and she had owned them all along. And now she was about to make them forget he ever existed. If she had always owned everything, why did she let him call her our wife? Why did she sit at the far end of that table? Why did she attend his wedding as a guest, stand in the storm and wait? And what exactly had she been waiting for? And the people he loved most? Did they choose to forget him? Or had she given them no other option? Dear viewers, this story is about a woman who was dismissed, displaced, and discarded by people who never stopped to ask who she really was. But it is also a masterclass in patience, hidden power, identity, and the devastating cost of underestimating someone's worth. You will learn how true power never announces itself until the moment it must, how dignity maintained in silence is far more dangerous than rage, and how the relationships we take for granted are often the architecture of our entire lives. Watch until the very end, then drop in the comments the biggest lesson you're taking away, and tell us, if you were in her shoes, what would you have done differently? Subscribe now for more stories that entertain, challenge, and transform the way you see the world. There are things a house remembers long after the people inside it have forgotten. The walls of the Whitmore estate on Caldwell Drive had absorbed 11 years of a particular kind of silence. The silence of a woman who had learned that the most dangerous thing she could do in that household was be fully known. Her name was Vivian, but no one in that house called her Vivian. So they called her our wife. And the phrase had become so embedded in the daily language of the household that even the housekeeper, Mrs. Aldridge, had stopped using her actual name sometime around year 3. Vivian had noticed. Vivian had filed it away in the same interior archive where she kept everything else that mattered. Quietly, without comment, without expression, without giving a single person in that house the satisfaction of knowing that she was paying attention to absolutely everything. Because that was the truth about Vivian that 11 years of domestic submission had successfully concealed. She was always, in every moment, paying attention to absolutely everything. She had arrived at the Whitmore household at 26, introduced to Raymond Whitmore by his mother Eleanor. It as a woman of good character and suitable temperament. Eleanor had meant it as a compliment, but Vivian had understood immediately what the older woman was actually communicating. We need someone who will not ask too many questions, who will not take up too much space, and who will make our household run smoothly without requiring anything inconvenient in return. Vivian had smiled, a specific calibrated smile she had spent years perfecting, and she had said, "I believe I can be exactly what this family needs." She had not been lying, but what she had offered the Whitmore family and what they had assumed she was offering were two entirely different things. And that gap, that beautiful, devastating gap between what they saw and what was actually there, was the foundation of everything that was coming. Raymond Whitmore was 41 when Vivian entered his life. He was the kind of man who moved through the world with the easy confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. His business, Whitmore Capital Group, was a mid-sized investment firm with a solid regional reputation and ambitions that consistently exceeded its actual reach. Raymond was charming, well-dressed, and possessed of the particular blindness that afflicts men who have always had someone managing the details of their lives on their behalf. He did not love Vivian. He had never pretended otherwise, at least not to himself. But he had needed her. And in the Whitmore family vocabulary, need and love had always been treated as interchangeable, which was perhaps the family's oldest and most expensive mistake. And what Raymond did not know, what no one in that household knew, was that Vivian Ashford had been born into a world so far above the Whitmore family's social altitude that the distance between them was almost geological. Her grandfather, William Ashford, had built the Ashford Group from a single textile factory in 1951 into one of the most quietly powerful private empires in American history. By the time Vivian was born, the Ashford Group controlled interests in manufacturing, real estate, energy infrastructure, and private equity across 14 states and 6 countries. It was not a company that appeared in magazines. It did not seek attention. It moved through the world the way very old, very serious money always moves, invisibly, deliberately, and with a patience that could outlast entire governments. Vivian's mother, Ma Catherine Ashford, had been the only child of William Ashford, and Vivian had been Catherine's only child, which meant that the woman Raymond Whitmore called our wife, the woman who ironed his shirts and managed his household calendar and sat silently at the far end of his dinner table, was, by every legal and structural measure, the sole heiress to $60 billion and the most significant private empire on the eastern seaboard. She had walked away from it at 25 after her mother's death, after a grief so profound it had temporarily dismantled every certainty she had ever held about who she was and what her life was supposed to mean. She had walked away and handed operational control of the Ashford Group to its board of directors, a board that had served her family for 3 generations and whose loyalty to the Ashford name was so absolute it bordered on devotional. With a single instruction, maintain everything. I will return when I am ready. The board had maintained everything, and they had waited. For 11 years they had waited, managing $60 billion of assets, filing quarterly reports to an address only they possessed, making decisions within the parameters Vivian had established before she left, and trusting, because they had no other option and because they knew Vivian Ashford well enough to know that her instincts had never once been wrong, that whatever she was doing inside that Whitmore household, she was doing it for a reason that would eventually be made clear. What Vivian was doing, in the simplest possible terms, was watching. She was watching Raymond Whitmore. She was studying the architecture of a man's character from the inside, studying how he treated people who could not retaliate, how he made decisions when he believed no one important was observing, how he responded to small kindnesses, and whether gratitude was something he was capable of sustaining beyond the initial receipt of a favor. She was learning something that no amount of background research or financial analysis could have taught her. She was learning what Raymond Whitmore was made of when he had nothing to prove. And what she found over 11 years of close and careful observation was exactly what she had quietly suspected from the beginning. Raymond Whitmore was a man who would always eventually reveal his ceiling. But the revelation she was waiting for, the specific, undeniable, irreversible act that would tell her everything she needed to know, had not yet come. And so she waited. She cooked. She managed. She sat at the far end of the table. She answered to our wife. She filed everything away. She watched Raymond's business grow in ways that had everything to do with the silent, strategic introductions she had arranged through intermediaries, the contracts she had quietly facilitated, the phone calls she had ensured were made by people who owed the Ashford name favors stretching back decades. And she watched Raymond accept that growth as the natural consequence of his own brilliance. And she waited. The woman Raymond Whitmore chose to marry instead was named Constance Bellamy. Constance was 32, decorative in the way that certain expensive things are decorative, beautiful to look at, impressive to display, and not designed for any use that required depth. She came from a family that had once had money and had spent the last 20 years maintaining the appearance of it with a kind of exhausting, elaborate performance that only people who have lost something real ever truly master. Her father, Gerald Bellamy, ran a consulting firm that consulted on very little and billed very generously, and her mother, Patricia, had been a fixture on the regional charity circuit for so long that people had stopped questioning whether the Bellamys actually contributed anything or simply attended everything. Raymond had met Constance at a fundraiser 6 months before the wedding. He had fallen, if falling was the right word for what Raymond Whitmore did, which was more accurately described as deciding that a particular acquisition was available and moving to secure it before someone else did, within 3 weeks. He had proposed within 4 months. He had told Vivian on a Tuesday evening, standing in the kitchen doorway while she was preparing dinner, as though the information were administrative rather than seismic. "I'm getting married he had said, to Constance Bellamy. The wedding is in 6 weeks. I'll need you to help coordinate the household arrangements." Vivian had turned from the stove. She had looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds during which Raymond Whitmore had experienced an inexplicable and fleeting sensation that he was standing in a room that was much larger than it appeared. Then she had said, "Of course," and turned back to the stove. She had helped coordinate the household arrangements. She had also, in those same 6 weeks, made 3 phone calls to the Ashford Group's board of directors. Not to instruct them to act, not yet, but to ensure that certain pieces were positioned correctly, that certain contracts were structured in ways that would become relevant very soon, that the board understood that the signal, when it came, would not be ambiguous. The board understood. On the day of the wedding, Vivian dressed carefully. A navy dress, understated, elegant, out of the kind of clothing that allowed the wearer to observe without being observed, and she attended as a guest. She sat 3 rows back. She watched Raymond Whitmore promise his life to Constance Bellamy with the expression of a woman who had already finished reading a book that everyone else in the room believed was just beginning. When it was over, Raymond found her at the edge of the reception and delivered the 6 words he had clearly been rehearsing. "You need to leave, right now." He had expected something. Tears, perhaps, argument, the particular desperation of a woman with nowhere to go. But Vivian had simply nodded, once, clean, final, and she had walked out of the reception, down the driveway, and through the iron gate she had painted 3 summers ago. Right into a storm that was dismantling the night with a ferocity that seemed almost deliberate. She stood in the rain. She did not cry. She took out a phone, not the phone Raymond knew about, but a second phone, older, encrypted, connected to a number only 8 people in the world possessed, and she sent a single message. 2 words. It's time. The motorcade assembled within the hour. 14 gold Rolls-Royces, the Ashford Group's formal fleet, reserved for occasions of the highest institutional significance, moved out of a private facility 40 miles away and began the drive toward Caldwell Drive with the unhurried absolute authority of a force that has never needed to rush because nothing it wants has ever been capable of running away. Inside the lead vehicle, a man named Hargrove, the Ashford Group's chief of operations, who had served the family for 27 years and whose devotion to Vivian specifically was something he had never found adequate words to express, sat with a briefing document on his knee and an expression of barely contained relief on his face. He had been waiting for that two-word message for 11 years. There had been moments, many moments, when he had wanted to call her, to ask how much longer, to remind her that the empire was ready, that the board was ready, that he was ready, but he had not called. Because Vivian Ashford had asked him to wait, and Hargrove had learned over 27 years that Vivian Ashford's sense of timing was not a thing to be questioned. The motorcade turned onto Caldwell Drive at 4:47 in the morning, and the storm was still tearing the sky apart, but the rain had softened slightly, as though even the weather understood that something significant was about to happen and had decided to observe rather than obstruct. The gold Rolls-Royces moved through the dark and the wet with their headlights cutting clean, sovereign lines through the night. And the sound of 14 precision engines at low throttle was the kind of sound that woke people from deep sleep and sent them to their windows without fully understanding why. Vivian was standing on the sidewalk outside the Whitmore gate when they arrived. Her navy dress was soaked. Her hair was flattened by the rain. She was standing with her hands at her sides and her chin level, and her eyes fixed on the middle distance with an expression that Hargrove, when he stepped out of the lead vehicle and saw her, would later describe to his wife as the most composed human face I have ever seen in my life. He walked to her. He stopped 2 feet away. He pressed his right fist lightly to his chest, the Ashford family gesture of formal respect, and he said, "The board has been waiting, ma'am. The empire is ready for its heiress." Vivian looked at him for a moment, and then, for the first time since she had walked through that iron gate, something moved across her face. Not tears, not triumph. Something quieter and more complete than either. "How is everything, Hargrove?" she asked. "Everything is exactly as you left it, ma'am," he said, "and precisely as you arranged it." She nodded. She walked to the lead Rolls-Royce. She sat down on leather that had been maintained for 11 years against the possibility of this exact moment. The door closed. The motorcade moved. Upstairs in the Whitmore house, Raymond stood at the bedroom window with a glass of bourbon in his hand. He had been woken by the sound of engines, 14 of them, and he had gone to the window expecting to see something he could dismiss. But what he saw instead were 14 gold Rolls-Royces carrying a crest he recognized, because he had seen that crest on contracts, on letterheads, on the signatures of people whose approval had, at various critical moments in the last 11 years, been the difference between his business surviving and collapsing. The Ashford crest. The realization arrived in pieces. The way catastrophic understanding always arrives, not all at once, but in a sequence of connecting recognitions that each make the next one worse. The Hargrove infrastructure deal. 3 years ago, the contract that had saved Whitmore Capital Group from a liquidity crisis so severe it would have ended the firm. The introduction had come through a third party, a lawyer Raymond had never met in person, and the terms had been inexplicably favorable, and Raymond had told himself it was because he was good at what he did. The Bellamy connection, Constance's family, the consulting firm that billed generously and consulted on very little, kept afloat for the last 6 years by a silent equity partner whose name appeared nowhere in any document Raymond had ever seen, but whose existence he was now, in this window, in this storm, beginning to understand. His mother's foundation. The annual donation that arrived every December from a private trust with a name Raymond had never investigated because the donation was generous and the paperwork was clean, and there had never seemed to be any reason to look deeper. Every thread, every single thread of the life he had just chosen over Vivian. The business, the friendships, the family stability, The social standing, the Bellamy marriage itself, ran directly through her hands, had always run through her hands. She had not built those connections to control him. She had built them the way an architect builds load-bearing walls, because a structure without them would eventually, inevitably, collapse. And now she was leaving. Raymond's hand tightened on the bourbon glass. Below him, the last of the 14 Rolls-Royces turned the corner and disappeared. And Caldwell Drive was quiet again, and the storm was beginning to ease, and the world looked exactly as it always had. Except that Raymond Whitmore could now see, with terrible clarity, that everything he was looking at was built on a foundation that had just driven away in a gold motorcade. He did not sleep that night. The Ashford Group's formal reinstatement of Vivian as heiress and chief executive took 48 hours to complete. 48 hours during which the board of directors, all 8 of them, moved through the legal and operational requirements with the efficiency of people who had been quietly rehearsing this moment for over a decade. By the end of those 48 hours, 3 things had happened in the world outside the Ashford Group's offices that Vivian had anticipated with a precision that the board found. And even after 27 years of working with her family, quietly remarkable. The first was that Gerald Bellamy's consulting firm received a letter from its silent equity partner, the private trust, informing him that the trust was exercising its right to withdraw its investment effective immediately, citing a standard portfolio rebalancing clause that Gerald had signed without reading in 2019. The letter was polite. The impact was not. Without that silent capital, the Bellamy consulting firm had approximately 90 days of operating runway. Gerald Bellamy spent the morning of the letter's arrival making phone calls to people who did not answer. And the second was that Whitmore Capital Group's largest institutional client, a regional infrastructure fund that represented 38% of the firm's annual revenue, notified Raymond that it was concluding their relationship at the end of the current contract cycle, citing a strategic realignment. The notification arrived on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, 2 of Whitmore Capital's 3 senior partners had begun quietly updating their professional profiles. The third was that Raymond's closest friend, a man named Douglas Cahill, who ran a mid-sized property development company and who had been Raymond's most consistent personal and professional ally for 15 years, called Raymond on Thursday morning and said in a voice that managed to be both apologetic and absolutely firm, I think you need to understand something about the last 11 years, Raymond. I think you need to understand it before you make any more decisions. Douglas Cahill had known, not everything, not the full scope of it, but enough. He had known since year 4 of Vivian's time in the Whitmore household, when a particular contract of his had been saved by an introduction that had come through channels he hadn't recognized, and he had traced it back, carefully, discreetly, to a source that had stopped him completely in the middle of his office on a Wednesday afternoon. He had not told Raymond. He had not told Raymond because he had understood, instinctively, that Vivian's silence was intentional, and that interfering with whatever she was doing was not a risk he was willing to take. And also, if he was fully honest with himself, and Douglas Cahill was, in his better moments, a man capable of full honesty, because he had recognized, in a way Raymond never had, that the woman in that household was extraordinary. And that extraordinary people, when they are finally done being patient, tend to be very clear about what they want. What Vivian wanted, it turned out, was not revenge. This was the thing that everyone, Raymond, the Bellamys, the board, even Hargrove, had expected and misread. They had expected punishment. They had expected the Ashford Group to dismantle Raymond Whitmore's world with the specific, targeted precision of someone settling a personal score. But Vivian Ashford had not spent 11 years inside Raymond Whitmore's household studying human nature just to spend the rest of her life thinking about Raymond Whitmore. What she wanted was to build. The Ashford Group's first public announcement under Vivian's leadership, its first public announcement in 30 years, because the family had never found any reason to speak publicly before, was a $2.3 billion investment in regional infrastructure, education, and small business development across the 3 counties surrounding Caldwell Drive. The announcement named 6 community organizations as primary partners. It established a foundation in Catherine Ashford's name. It created 400 direct employment positions in the first year. It did not mention Raymond Whitmore. It did not need to. Because the most complete form of making someone forget you ever existed is not erasing their name. It is building something so significant, so luminous, is so undeniably real in the place where they thought they mattered, that the question of whether they ever mattered at all simply stops occurring to anyone. Within 6 months, Caldwell Drive, the street where Vivian had stood in the rain outside a gate she had painted with her own hands, was renamed Ashford Avenue as part of a municipal development initiative that the county board approved unanimously and enthusiastically. The ceremony was attended by local officials, community leaders, and 800 residents. Raymond Whitmore was not invited. He was, by that point, in the process of restructuring Whitmore Capital Group into a much smaller operation, 3 employees, a modest office, and a client list that no longer included anyone connected to the Ashford Group's extended network, which turned out to be almost everyone. And he was not destitute. Vivian had not arranged for him to be destitute. She had simply, by leaving, removed the invisible scaffolding that had been holding his world at an altitude it was never capable of maintaining on its own. Constance Bellamy filed for divorce 8 months after the wedding. Her reasons, as stated in the filing, were irreconcilable differences. Her actual reason, as she confided to her mother in a conversation that Patricia Bellamy repeated to 3 people by the following morning, was that she had married a man she believed was substantial and had discovered almost immediately that what she had mistaken for substance was simply proximity to someone else's depth. Raymond received the divorce filing on a morning in November. He sat with it at his kitchen table for a long time. And then he went to the window, the same window where he had stood with his bourbon glass and watched the motorcade drive away. And he looked out at the street that no longer bore the name he had always associated with his own success. He thought about a woman who had risen before the sun every morning for 11 years, a woman who had sat at the far end of a table where no chair had ever been pulled out for her, a woman who had attended his wedding in a navy dress and an expression like someone watching a chess match they had already won. A woman who had walked into a storm without crying and had sent a 2-word message into the dark. He thought about 11 years of Our Wife, and for the first time, the very first time, Raymond Whitmore understood what those 2 words had actually cost him. Not what they had cost Vivian, what they had cost him. Because the thing about dismissing a person of extraordinary depth is not that you lose them. It is that you lose every version of yourself that their presence had been quietly, patiently, invisibly making possible. Raymond Whitmore had not just lost Vivian. He had lost the better man he might have become if he had ever once been still enough, humble enough, genuinely curious enough to ask her, not our wife, but Vivian, who she actually was. That question, the one he had never asked, was now the only thing left in every room he entered. And in an office 30 miles away, in a building whose architecture was the cleanest and most precise thing on the city skyline, Vivian Ashford sat at the head of a table where her chair was always, without exception, pulled out for her. As she reviewed the morning's reports, she made 3 decisions that would affect the financial futures of approximately 12,000 people. She asked Hargrove about his daughter's university applications. She laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind of laugh that had never once been heard inside the walls of the Whitmore estate, at something he said in response. She was not thinking about Raymond Whitmore. She had not thought about Raymond Whitmore in 6 months. And that, more than the motorcade, more than the announcement, more than the renamed street, more than every contract and every withdrawal and every restructuring, was the most complete and final form of what had happened. She didn't just own the empire, she owned her life. And Raymond Whitmore, standing at a window on a street that no longer knew his name, Warren was only now beginning to understand what it had always cost to own nothing at all.